This camera's arrival on the market in 1959 marked the end for the parent company's historic line of 35mm folding cameras. Let's find out more and watch this video. By the late 1950s, the era of the folding 35mm camera had run its course, and there was now a demand for a different type of camera. I think younger photographers wanted something more traditional, something that wasn't developed in the 1930s, and Kodak in return responded by producing this fixed lens version of its Retina series. I've heard it called Retina, but because it's supposedly retina like an eye, I think I always pronounce it retina. In any case, this is the Retina 2S. It's a fixed lens version of what I believe is the Retina 3C Big C model. I've only ever seen this camera with a Xenar lens, which is a Tessar type. Supposedly there was a faster Schneider, no, it wouldn't be Schneider, it'd be Rodenstock, Heliagon lens, like an f1.9, but I've never actually seen it with that lens. I've only ever seen this camera with a 2.8 Xenar. However, I'm not discounting the possibility that it does exist. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and dive into this camera a bit. As you can see, it's a fixed lens camera. That means the camera lens is fixed to the camera, is not interchangeable. The Retina cameras, the later Retina cameras, the C modeled, B and C modeled cameras allowed you to interchange the front elements. Sort of slick, and there is another video that explains that. What's important about the Kodak Retina cameras? The Retina series was launched in 1933. This camera was first produced in 1959, so that would have been 26 years earlier, so an entire generation, so to speak. I think a generation is roughly 25 years. And more importantly, however, with the launch of the Kodak Retina series back in 1933 came the daylight loading 35mm cartridge. Prior to that, 35mm film photographers had to preload all of their own film cassettes in the dark. Now all of a sudden Kodak had offered photographers the opportunity to simply take a film cassette out of their pocket of the camera, load their film, and start shooting. There was no more need to preload each cassette. And the way it was done was a real pain in the neck because you had to pre-measure a certain length of film. So Kodak certainly made it much easier for the photographer, and you can really see how that 35mm film canister, first introduced in 1933, continues to live on today, 70, 80, 90 years later in 2023, albeit at a much reduced market presence. All right, let's get back to this camera. This camera had several notable features. It had a selenium cell made by Gaussen, and sometimes if you look a certain way, you can actually see the name Gaussen in the meter. It's usually right in the center of the meter. In any case, it was a sealed meter, and so for the most part, these meters remain active today. Here's the Kodak emblem, and it had a synchro compure shutter with speeds running from 1 second to 1/500th of a second. It's a very, very good range. Let me see if I can get this right. This is a coupled meter. Coupled meter? Yes, it means that the meter is coupled to these to the shutter speed and the aperture. Now, as you can see, this uses the so-called dreaded EV system. So as you can see, as you change the shutter speed, the aperture changes in kind. It had a front self-focusing lens. It had the synchro compure shutter, full range of apertures from f2.8 to f22. It had a frame counter on top, had your meter needle here on the right side, and another film minder dial on the left side. Eyepiece on the back. You worked in conjunction to reset the frame counter. On the bottom of the camera is your film advance, which also tensions the shutter. This is your rewind button. Is that press and release? Don't know. And this small dial here helps you operate the meter. And I'll go over that in more detail in a few minutes. To open the back, you would push this little wing out of the way and press the silver button at the same time. See, then the back opens. Inside it's pretty traditional. You have your pressure plate. The purpose of the pressure plate is to keep the film flat against the film gate so that you get as sharp a photo as possible. Here's your sprocket wheel, and then here's your take-up spool. Everything's fairly traditional. Push this upward, drop in your fresh roll of film, push this down, take up any slack, put your leader in one of the slots here. Go ahead and wind it a bit. Let's see. Oh yeah, that's very convenient. Okay. And you would fire off 2 blanks. Then you would reset your frame counter. This is a countdown frame counter. So in order to count down, for example, if you only had a roll 24 in here, you would push this small silver button, and then you would push this dial to the right, or this dial button, I guess you could call it. Not really a dial, but a button. Dial spins, but a button just moves. So you would push this button to the right until you came to 24. One curious thing is when you reach the end of your when you reach the end of the roll of film, the film advance locks. That prevents you from tearing the film right out of the canister. So it's just another safety measure. This is a push and release rewind button. To rewind your film, you would simply push in this small silver button. It's push and release, and then you would turn your crank and rewind the film. Turn this knob and rewind the film. A crank was much easier, but that was to come. That was to come for cameras. Here's your accessory shoe. This was useful for mounting a flash. You could use an electronic or bulb flash with this. And here's your synchronization socket. Or you could also use this with some of the accessory lenses, such as close-up lenses that had their own, that came with their own rangefinder. Now the synchro computers had 3 settings: X, M, and V. X and M were for your flash synchronization. X meant electronic, M meant bulb, and V was self-timer. As you can see from the slightly purplish reflections, this was a coated lens. But without even looking at it, I knew it was a coated lens because this camera was made from 1959 to 1960. And by that time, all lenses produced by German manufacturers were coated. This camera was made in Germany at Kodak's Stuttgart facility, where it had been making cameras since since the early 1930s. There's a very interesting history of this camera and the camera designer who had passed away long before he ever saw any of these cameras come to fruition. Very briefly, Kodak purchased Nagel Camera Works in 1932, I believe it was. And then they produced several cameras, several small folding cameras under the Kodak name. And they were pretty much rebadges of their own cameras. And then in 1933, it released the first Retina. The first Retina is notable because it was taken to Mount Everest by Sir Hillary. The first man to scale Mount Everest took a camera with him. I don't believe he took a selfie. Or maybe he did. He just took a photo. Might have had himself in it. Sir Edmund Hillary was the first man to scale Mount Everest in 1953. And he actually took a little Kodak Retina camera from 1933. It was already 20 years old by that time, with him, and he took a photograph. He was born in 1919, so he would have been 34 when he climbed Mount Everest, and he lived to the ripe old age of 89. Yeah, he lived to be 89 years old and passed away in 2008 in Auckland, New Zealand. So Sir Edmund Hillary took a Kodak Retina Type 118. So he took the second model of the Retina up to Mount Everest, and I'll show you that sometime. I actually have Type 118. Type 117 is the first one. That one's been, you know, it's out there, but I have just been so far unwilling to pay that amount. As I mentioned, I think the Retina 2S is the non-folding version of the Retina 3C, Big C, and you can see what I mean. There are so many similarities between the two cameras. You can see how their viewing window and rangefinder window are almost identical, uses the same meter. If you look at the body shape, the body height from base to shoulder, very much the same. Even the top deck. The top decks are very similar. Aside from one being a fixed lens and one being a folding camera, the location of the accessory shoe, this, you know, shutter release, frame counter, even these are very similar. Turn them on their back, and you really couldn't tell which was which if I just held them like this. This is the same, this is the same. What's the difference between these two cameras? Not a whole lot. It's mainly in the lens. So the Retina 3C, Big C, this has a Schneider Xenon f2.0, and this has the Schneider Xenar f2.8. This should be, I believe, a 5-element lens, and this is going to be a 4-element lens. Here is the difference, though. With this, you could remove the front element, and then you could. There was a 35 millimeter, and then there were two 80 millimeters. One was a higher speed one was just a lower speed. And of course this collapsed and this one does not. But if you look, they are very much the same camera. But it's okay. They're both really great cameras. Real quickly, let's weigh the camera. This comes in at 1 pound. I think we could say 1 pound 6 ounces. What about the 3C? 1 pound 7 ounces. Let's get back to this camera. All right, so running the meter is slightly complicated. Needlessly so. It uses what's called a match needle system. So in order to meter a scene, get your best exposure, correct exposure, you would turn this dial. And you would turn this dial until your pointer sat over your meter needle. Then that would then give you various combinations of shutter speeds and apertures. So if you wanted, let's say if you wanted a faster aperture, then you could just simply turn these two, because these were coupled. So you can see as you use slower speeds, you have to compensate by using a smaller aperture. And as you use faster speeds, the opposite is true. How did this all work? It works through a very complex system in which the meter sits here, and there was a small piece of twine, I guess it is, and it runs down here where it hooks around a pulley. Then it comes up here where it hooks around another pulley that is part of this geared wheel assembly. And if your string ever slips off this pulley that's hidden, you're going to have a very, very difficult time reattaching it. Not impossible, but you you have to remove the front of the camera to be able to get to that pulley. I think it's one of the more complex systems to have ever been developed. And like I said, if that string ever comes off the pulley, you're in trouble. And if it does happen, you know what you do? You just simply use a handheld meter, because this will never be accurate. And yeah, so you just have to use a handheld meter. I've shot with the Xenar quite a bit. Very sharp lens, has those Tessar qualities. Which is sometimes when you're shooting at, let's say between wide open down to f5.6, I would say, or 5.6, and at a medium distance, you get what's, you know, a sort of a round, out of focus highlights. I do have some examples, not taken with this particular camera, but I'll show them on screen, just so you can get an idea what they talk about round, out of focus backgrounds. This was probably nearly the last of the line of really well-made cameras. With some of these, what you'll sometimes find is pitting on the top. I'm not really sure, but I've seen a good number of cameras with some pitting on the top. I suspect that it was because the satin chrome finish, whatever they used to protect it or to cover it, was good, but didn't stand up to like harsh elements, or I think being outdoors, or being left outdoors, and certainly not being stored in a garage or basement or such. Typical problems are same as you'll have with any leaf shutter. The shutter leaves can get gummed up. The entire shutter mechanism, which is just a series of gears, sometimes needs to be flushed and then re-lubricated. And but otherwise, once they're serviced, these are very. I should mention that there was a companion model to this, the Retina 3S, and the 3S had true interchangeable lenses and was a much larger camera. And this is the 3S, and you can see how it's actually a wider camera. I think it sits, yes, vertically they're the same, but back to back, you can see how the 3S is actually wider than the 2S. And it's heavier too. Comparatively, the Retina 3S weighs 1 pound 12 ounces, so it's considerably larger, and well, not considerably, it's larger but considerably heavier than the 2S, because the 2S weighs 1 pound 6 ounces versus 1 pound 12 ounces. So it's a good 6 ounces heavier. Not quite half a pound, but you're approaching half a pound of weight difference. So why would you choose this camera over the 3S when you can get true interchangeable lenses? Well, basically, some people really like to be able to just shoot with one lens. And there were many photographers who didn't want the complexity of an interchangeable lens camera. They wanted a camera that met certain specifications. One is high quality. Some people wanted a German-made camera, and some people wanted a very good lens. The Retina, the Xenar, is a very good lens. It wasn't the premium lens at the time, but it was still a very good lens. These are still available on the used market. As always, you'll probably have to clean the viewfinder. You might have to service the shutter, and you'll probably have to recalibrate the rangefinder. They're all fairly simple things to do, but they do take time. I always figure on maybe 3 hours per camera. I'm not in a rush to try to get this done as quickly as possible. And then you'll have a camera that will properly serviced. This camera should run problem-free for the next 15 to 20 years. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more, please leave your suggestions in the comments. Also, don't forget to hit that like button and keep on taking photos.